everyone, and welcome back to the Tales from the Castle podcast. My name is Blythe.
Hi there, my name's Gwen.
And tonight we are talking all things Dunbar, the town, the castle, the first battle, the 1338 siege, and of course, the family, most specifically the members of the family that played an important role in Scottish politics and the Anglo-Scottish border conflict in the days of the early Stuart monarchs. And tonight, in a refreshing change of pace, we're also going to talk about the importance of women in history. And I think on that note, we can start by saying that originally this episode was meant to focus on the two most prominent 14th century Dunbar ladies, both conveniently named Agnes. And I think it's fair to say, Gwen, that the last few weeks with this topic have really taken us to a few unexpected places.
Yes, they certainly have. I think we started off thinking that we would look into the lives of particularly an older lady, which was Black Agnes, she was called. And we were obviously very interested in her story. And I think people were probably most famous medieval women that we actually know about. And then we thought, well, let's look at her niece, who we know that was the lover. It's not probably the right quite word. Mistress is the right word, of David II. So we were quite interested in that, obviously with our connection back to Dundonald Castle, which is obviously Robert II's castle. So we were quite interested to find out about that. And the things we've found out have been absolutely incredible, haven't they, Blythe?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is we wanted to talk about Agnes and hit some roadblocks in that, as famous, especially as Black Agnes is, we don't know anything about her. And that's really frustrating. There's very little known about her. We found out a little bit about her genealogy through the men in her family. But apart from that, we found, sort of very little concrete about her, outside of the siege, of course, which is well talked about. And I think it was the same with the other Agnes. So that sent us down looking at the men in the family. And while we went down these rabbit holes of all the different men in the family, I think it became really apparent to both of us how important and how much of an impact the women made on this family, despite the fact that they're usually not but blips or mentions in the history books. Really, multiple times through the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, the lives of the entire Dunbar families were changed by these women.
They were indeed. And also I felt as if when I was reading it that there was the castle itself at Dunbar, right, has been subject to quite a few different women who have had to hold out, in times of terrible situations for them, and obviously sieges, but there have also been places where people have gone for refuge. And I think there's been a certain feeling that this castle has been the edge of the world because of where it sits, obviously right on the east coast of Scotland, and your views from the actual cliff top. You can see right across to Fife, you can see the Bass Rock, and you can also see Edinburgh from there. So it was obviously a very important strategic point. And when you see that, when you realise that this castle was built, it was an enormous, great big curtain wall that actually had a sea gate. So it means people could arrive by sea. So it's been the subject of quite a few people trying to take over the castle over the years. And obviously, as I say, refuge, which we can talk about a wee bit later on.
I think we'll definitely come back to that because it is so important. The castle and the people in it are so important to the Wars of Independence. So I think to kick off this discussion then, let's talk about a couple of not so important people. One of them is a guy that we are affectionately calling Sir Patrick, not Earl. And that is...
It's Sir Patrick Dunbar, the one that confused us the most, isn't it? Because we thought that we actually suspected he was an Earl, because there's so many of them are called Patrick. Basically, it goes right back to 1185 or probably beyond that. And they're called Patrick. It's a very popular name in the family. We did discover why. I just kind of discover why that is. But so Patrick is the father of who we're calling Bonnie Agnes. But Bonnie Agnes, basically to differentiate between her and Black Agnes. They both have the same name. They're both called Agnes Dunbar.
And this Sir Patrick, speaking of important women, is married to Isabel Randolph, who is Black Agnes's sister. So that's starting our tangled web of Stuarts, Randolphs, Dunbars, and Douglases, which will only get more tangled as we move on throughout the podcast, I think. So I think the reason that our Sir Patrick, not Earl, as we're calling him, is important is because he is father of three people that we're really going to focus on in this podcast. Agnes, as Gwen mentioned, but also her brothers George and John. I think it's really important that we start with Agnes. And Agnes, Bonnie Agnes, as we're calling her, was probably born in the late 1340s, early 1350s. We don't have an exact date for her, but we know that by 1369, she is old enough to be David II's mistress. And it's through this link, her being the mistress of David II, that really gets the rest of her family elevated. So we're not really sure if it's her relationship with David that gets George his earldom in 1368, because we're not really sure if that connection existed that early. We do know, though, that it is this connection with David II that elevates her brother John to the earldom of Fife and gets him married to one of Robert Stuart's children, Marjorie, which Robert Stuart, as we can imagine, is probably not too chuffed about, because John's fairly low in status compared to the people he's used to marrying his children off. Now, what makes this slightly more scandalous is that at the time of her becoming David II's mistress, Agnes was actually married. And we know this because in 1369, while she's living presumably at Stirling Castle, where her guardian, Robert Erskine, was custodian, George grants lands and titles to the heirs of his sister Agnes and her husband, Robert Maitland. And we know that there's at least one son from this marriage, because in 1400, there is a nephew of her brother George named Robert Maitland, who's present at Dunbar Castle. It seems pretty likely that David was headed towards marrying Agnes. I mean, he arranged a formal divorce from his previous wife, Margaret, and that doesn't seem like something that he would have done if he was just planning on taking a mistress. And in January of 1371, so only a month before his death, he granted Agnes an annual rent of 1,000 marks from the customs of Aberdeen and Haddington. But David dies on the 22nd of February, 1371, and later on the following year, we assume that Robert Maitland must have passed away, because Agnes goes on to marry someone else on Bonnie Agnes, despite the fact that it's likely because of her that the rest of her family, and certainly her brother, especially her brother John, were elevated and became such important members of the Scottish nobility in the late 14th century.
And also what I found really interesting was when I was looking through their genealogy I mentioned, but it's quite fascinating to see that they all connect back to Walter, the third High Steward of Scotland. Now they were the predecessors of Dundonald Castle, and they would have had their own castle there. And when you look up most of his children were actually born there. And on both sides, for John, Agnes and George, their father, they're directly related to Eupheme Fitzalan Stuart, who's the daughter of Walter III Stuart. And on their mother's side, through Isabella Stuart, which is their grandmother, she's the daughter of Sir John Stuart, who's the son of Alexander, the fourth High Steward. And me, I always like Alexander because he built that huge, big, massive, almost citadel-sized castle on top of the hill. So what we're finding too when we look at this is that they're all kind of connected very closely. And I suppose if you think about it at that time, the populations of Scotland were quite small. There wasn't a great amount of people living here. And obviously the nobility were probably quite a small circle of people that all knew each other. But it is quite worrying just how many are related, and that also, to widen that out slightly, just as a matter of interest, if we look down to the line of Robert the Bruce, who is obviously Robert II's grandfather, they're related to Walter the III High Steward as well, as are all the Dunbars, every one of them, and all through the whole situation of what happened with the Randolphs. They're also related. And a lot of the wives and husbands are as well. So that's what I think is a really important thing to think about, is that they may well all have seemed to be, like all these different names, but really they were all kind of related, and there was a lot of stuff going on. I don't know that that's any different to nobility today, right enough. I do. That's quite a common thing, but So, but yeah, anyway, so maybe that's worth the thought that we're looking at people who are kind of, they probably would have all known each other quite well. So that might answer some of the questions that we do have about the situation with Agnes and David II. It's very likely that they knew each other for quite a long time.
So I wonder if the Dunbars' connection to the Stuarts then presumably has something to do with them having to get, with David II having to call for a papal dispensation for John Dunbar to be able to marry Robert Stuart's daughter Marjorie.
Probably, it could well be. I mean, they're quite closely connected. There's not a great deal of, I mean, they're not like first cousins, but
within a few degrees of cousins.
Yes, enough to worry, probably to worry the Pope as well at that time. I'm sure. I actually reckon there's probably quite a queue outside when he opened his door for all these different nobles arriving in Avignon asking for dispensations to marry.
John Dunbar's marriage to Marjorie Stuart seems to be the first real sign of David II's patronage for the Dunbar family after his relationship picks up with Agnes, doesn't it? That happens in 1370, around the time he gives John the earldom of Fife. Yes. So it's kind of two insults to Robert Stuart. Not that this is about Robert Stuart, but it's kind of two insults to Robert Stuart at one time, isn't it? Because the earldom of Fife is a hugely important title in Scotland at the time. And there's Robert Stuart's presumably got his eyes on it, and it goes to this John Dunbar, who is a younger son and someone that is presumably not very important up to that point. And his daughter is also given to this person. So it's probably not a very happy Robert at that moment.
I would imagine not, no.
But then everything turns around after David II dies. And I won't go into too much detail, but if you've not listened to our podcast on the life of Robert II, or perhaps watched our YouTube video on the relationship between Robert II and David II, I think perhaps this is where you take a break and do so. Because there is an episode after David II dies where essentially William Douglas rocks up at Linlithgow with a handful of, they say, armed troops, presumably with the aims of stopping Robert Stuart from being crowned king. And that, as we believe, ends with the Dunbars, John and George, showing up and saying, no, we believe Robert should be king. And this, as you can imagine, halts everything, because you would think that John and George would have been staunch allies of David. Their sister was his mistress. They were getting all sorts of lands, titles, money from David II. You would think that they would have been enemies of Robert. Again, there is a backstory there, so you might want to listen to our other podcast if you haven't done so. So it seems as if they've turned, but then John, the Earl of Fife, is mysteriously and very conspicuously absent from Robert II's coronation. So it's a bit of a strange relationship there. And then directly after the coronation, Robert II starts questioning John's claim on the earldom of Fife, which, as you can imagine, doesn't make John very happy. And that actually ends up in Robert paying John some money and swapping John, the earldom of Fife, for the earldom of Moray. And it's a slightly smaller, slightly truncated version of the earldom of Moray, because the lordships of Lochaber, Badenoch, and the castle of Urquhart had all been given off piecemeal to powerful nobles in the north. So he's getting the earldom of Moray, which is something that his family actually had a claim to a few generations back, but he's not getting the whole thing. Of course, this causes a lot of friction for John, and specifically caused him frequently to clash with Robert II's other son, Alexander, the Wolf of Badenoch. But John still goes on to have a bit more involvement in central government, and he actually sits in what is sort of deemed by Alistair MacDonald a meeting of the Scottish War Cabinet in 1380 with other important nobles such as the Earl of Carrick, the Earl of Douglas, the Earl of March. And he's also present in 1384 at Anglo-Scottish border negotiations. Unfortunately, he dies sometime around 1391 to 1392, so he doesn't actually live very long.
Yeah, and isn't it something strange about how he got very involved in the kind of jousting tournament circuit, and he was in Smithfield in London, and he's been given, he's quite a well versed guy, and then he did some kind of tournament in York, And then
Yeah.
we think he seriously died. They think it might have been injuries, but they don't really know. And isn't that quite strange for somebody who is so well known that we don't actually know what his death was caused by?
Yeah, that's a strange thing, as you say, not to know, and not to have a date for his death. But it's also, we don't have a date for his brother's death either. His older brother, George, who was the Earl of March, was, even more important than him. And by the end of his life, we don't know when he died either. We have a massive date range. At least for John, we know that he died. There's kind of a 6-month range that we know he died between. George could have died anytime between 1416 and 1425. I guess that brings us on to George then.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it does.
And George is really important out of the three of them because he is the oldest brother. He gets the earldom in 1368, and this is a topic of some contention, even between the lovely Lady Gwen and I, trying to figure out how on earth George gets the earldom. So it seems everyone and every source has something different to say.
Yeah, well, I'd been reading it that what happened was he had got the earldom from his great uncle, who was surprise, was called Patrick, right? Was the 8th Earl. And as far as I was concerned, he was also the same man who was married to Black Agnes, who was a Bonnie Agnes's and George and John's auntie, right? And it seemed that there was something to do with the fact that David II had said to him he was to give his earldom over to young George, because George wasn't a direct descendant of the earls. His father was probably a younger brother of the earls, so he was descended as well from his grandfather being only Sir Alexander Dunbar. He wasn't an earl. So there was something kind of strange going on there, but I kind of wondered if it was something to do with David II's interest in his sister.
It is close enough. I mean, 1368, if by 1369 he has her shacked up and he's giving her large amounts of money, as you say, he probably knew her for a long time. Seemingly might have been a relationship there long before 1369 that might have involved the promotion of her brother George. It's just that we don't know about it until he started actually making payments to her in 1369. Mm-hmm. Looking at what has been written, we see sort of different wording for it. So we see that Earl Patrick, so the last Earl Patrick, we'll call him the 8th Earl. We've seen him called the 8th or the 9th Earl, but for the purposes of this podcast, Earl Patrick, the last Earl Patrick, is the 8th Earl, and George is the 9th Earl. We've seen that he sort of abdicated or he gave up that post. Nothing has said why he did that. We can't find a single source that says why he does that, under what circumstances. We know that as late as 1367, so that's the year before George gets the earldom, he is signing documents in Parliament as the Earl of March. So he still has that title at least as late as 1367, September of 1367. And he's still alive at least as late as September of 1367. But then I also read a source, which, again, it's all in the wording here, that says he passed it to his nephew George, which is possible because George's father died in 1357, didn't he?
That's right.
So if Earl Patrick didn't have any sons and seemingly didn't have any nephews, it might have passed to his great nephew. But it's been really difficult for us to get the full genealogy of this family.
And every so often you think you've just about got it, and then something else confusing pops up.
Yeah, like people, like some sources saying that John, George, and Agnes's father's name was John. And then some sources saying that Sir Patrick's father was Earl Patrick, which you found and I've also seen. So
yes, but then it made more sense that he wasn't Earl himself, because he was his father was, as I said, Sir Alexander Dunbar, and the dates fit. I think the important thing to look at is you have to be very canny with the dates when you're looking up things like this, because as long as you've got something of the dates, and they mostly they're mostly correct for the things you're looking at, and a wee bit about the history, and as Blythe was saying, looking up documents which they've signed, you've got an idea about their age. Other than that, it can be really confusing, but I think we've actually cracked it, Blythe. I think we did a really good job this week.
I think
bit of history sleuthing going on there. I think
we should post in the show notes the fantastic graphic that you've made of the family tree, and then next to it, the one that I made last night that is 97% eraser marks.
Well, but the thing is, because of that I discovered something today when I was making the other graphic with the family tree. I can't remember what it was now. Oh yeah, it was for Cecilia fitted in. Now, people obviously think we're just havering here, but actually Cecilia was important because she was married to James V, High Steward of Scotland. And Blythe has got a bit of, she really likes James V.
He's my hero.
He's her favourite. So whenever something connects with him, I always make sure that she finds out about it, because I know it'll make her day.
It does. Guys, Google him. He is the most underappreciated character in world history. I will go that far.
I think we'll need to do I think, and I'm sure that the listeners would be, if they were able to contact us immediately about this, they'd be phoning in to say, quick, do another podcast on James V, High Steward. And I think that's what we'll have to do.
I would love to. If you ever come to the castle and are unlucky enough to be stuck on one of my tours, I do spend an inordinate amount of time telling my guests about James, but he is fascinating.
I think that's us. We've made a date then, so it's going to be James V, High Steward, the next one. Because actually, this has brought me a lot of information that I didn't know, and I'm going to be writing a blog about him, so it'll be quite useful. But yeah, no, it's been absolutely fascinating, and I do think that these are people who have lived, right? They've actually lived. They've had these intensely challenging situations, and we can sit here and we can say, well, that was the date that Edward I came and absolutely and utterly destroyed Berwick, killing on an average between 4,000 and 17,000 people who lived there. It was called the Alexandria of the North. People believed it to be one of the most, it was the second to London in terms of its success and flourishing trade and, with Europe. So people who lived in Dunbar at the time would have known this was going on, and they would have basically been waiting to be the next victim. And actually that's exactly what happened, because after Edward I destroyed and killed everybody he possibly could in Berwick, he waited a month there, and he then racked up and came into Dunbar, and that castle was besieged, and it was an absolutely dreadful situation. There was a Battle of Dunbar that happened after that. So we can just see all these people, and they've lived most of these people who we've got down there on the the sort of like the notes beside their names, they've lived through intensely difficult situations. And so, I think we couldn't possibly imagine most of this stuff that's going on, but I like to think that we should imagine it, because we have to, put into context, these are people probably who would chase our family tree. At least one of the people on that little family tree that I made today will be related to one of us. That's usually what you find. So without these people, we wouldn't be here. So I think there's a great respect to what they've had to deal with. And I think particularly how they managed to maintain what I can see is a strengthening, because if we want to go back to George just for a wee minute, because I think he is probably the character with the most information about him, I would suggest. He became something of an amazing warlord. He became a war chief. Isn't that right, Blythe? Did you find all that? Did you find that information as well?
Yeah. So throughout the 1370s and the 1380s, George, the Earl of March or Dunbar, along with the Douglases, are really almost ruling the border conflict in the South. And again, this is something we touched on a little bit in our podcast about Robert II, but Robert II almost turns a blind eye to what's happening in the borders and really lets the border lords sort of run rampant down there. And George, the 9th Earl, does, and he actually manages to accomplish quite a lot in that time. In the 1370s, he takes back tons of territory in Berwickshire. And then in the 1380s, he moves on to Annandale, takes back territory from the English in Annandale. So he is a really, really important and key military leader, if you can call him that, in the south of Scotland. And his, spoilers here, but his defection to England, which we'll get to in just a minute, I'm sorry if I have just spoiled the whole thing for you, is a massive blow to Scotland. So we basically have George's story through his brother and sister up until after Robert II becomes king. So we know that he presumably received some kind of patronage from David II after Agnes became his mistress. And then after David II dies, for whatever reason, he shows up with his brother at William Douglas's Congress at Linlithgow and supports Robert II's claim to the throne, which I think surprised everyone. Surprised me when I read about it.
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
And then, as we've talked about, he goes on to become this really key leader in the fight against England. And it's not so much England itself, although he does lead some forays into northern England in the 1370s and 1380s. It's more about retaking the territory that they call the English Pale, so the territories that England is still occupying in the south of Scotland, particularly Berwickshire and Annandale. But in 1395, something happens in his family that kind of sets him off. And we're going back to women here. So around 1395, George's daughter, Elizabeth Dunbar, had a relationship and, according to the sources, might have even been married to Robert III's son and then heir, David Stuart, the Duke of Rothesay. By 1395, the bishops of St. Andrews and Brecon had a papal mandate to allow Elizabeth and David to marry. So we know there were at least plans there to marry. Though it seems clear in the following year, so in 1396, that there was perhaps not sufficient support in Parliament, or that Robert III himself had not really approved the marriage. And the general argument or the consensus seems to be that the papal dispensation for the marriage had been rushed through. And so according to the chronicle accounts, in 1396, Robert III declared the marriage, so again, this is where we think maybe they actually had been married, declared the marriage invalid on the grounds that David had married Elizabeth before the papal dispensation had come through, which then prompted David and Elizabeth to ask Pope Benedict XIII for absolution by the end of 1396. And in 1397, Pope Benedict XIII declared that they should be allowed to marry officially after a period of separation. Now, to put this into perspective, David was 19 at the time.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
So this really is think about this pair of romantic youths clinging to each other. You would think so in love, rushing to get married despite the fact that nobody wants them to. His father doesn't want him to. His father, the king, doesn't want him to. It's implied that Parliament doesn't want him to. And eventually the Pope says, you can marry, but you have to separate for a time. Imagine the drama. So they separate, presumably from 1397, you would think, with the aim of remarrying after a period of separation. But by 1400, they hadn't remarried. And in 1400, David sets Elizabeth aside and marries Mary Douglas. So not just anyone, but the daughter of the third Earl of Douglas. So the Douglases are basically the arch nemesis of the Earls of March and Dunbar, so of the southern branch of the Dunbar family. So this is Shakespeare couldn't write this.
Exactly. It sounds like he maybe had something kind of Romeo and Juliet going on here when they were
really writing. Is.
Shakespeare did know this story.
As you can imagine, George, Elizabeth's father, is infuriated. And as the story goes, again, this is all chronicles, so who knows how much of this is made up, but as the story goes, upon hearing of David's betrothal, he went to see David and demanded that either the marriage be carried out or that his money be refunded. So presumably when he's asking for his money, you'd think he's probably asking for a dowry back, right? Mm-hmm. But when David didn't respond favorably, George then went to Henry IV of England.
Oh my goodness.
I know. I told you this was juicy. And he encouraged Henry IV to mount an invasion of Scotland, which he then did in 1400. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it seems like at the time, his neighbors had all known that George had gone to Henry, but they didn't think it was serious, essentially, until the English were almost at their doorstep. And then they realized it was serious. And it caused him to lose many of his retainers, even family, including, and I talked about this guy before, his nephew, Robert Maitland. So that must be Agnes's son from her first marriage to Robert Maitland, unless there's another Robert Maitland in his family. And at the time, this nephew was the keeper of Dunbar Castle. So essentially he's taking care of Dunbar Castle whenever George can't be around. And so all of these people deserted him, and it gave the Douglases, so the arch nemesis, and now, David's new family, significantly more power in the south of Scotland. And around the same time, so in the summer of 1400, while George was in England, David the Duke of Rothesay, and the Douglases captured Dunbar Castle, likely with Robert Maitland's help, and they left George stuck in England. Though somehow he was able to return to retain Lochmaben, Cockburn's Path, and Fast Castle for the English. So significant damage done to Scotland, all because of this, this spurned woman, Elizabeth Dunbar. And it does get worse. We'll get there.
Wow, worse?
So we're going to take just a quick break there to do some backstory. In 1398 to 1402, I think this is important just to understand what's happening bigger picture. David, the Duke of Rothesay, took over lieutenancy of Scotland, which is a bit funny. It's like karma, because if you listen to our last episode, you'll know that his father, the one-time Earl of Carrick, had done that to his father before him. They had called the council and deemed his father incapable of ruling. And that's exactly what David did to his father, Robert III. With the council ruling that they were largely critical of the king, Robert III's, ability to govern. Interestingly, Thomas Dunbar, so John Dunbar's son, was on David's new special council that he'd set up. In 1402, though, David was arrested essentially by his uncle, the Duke of Albany, for being out of control, for taking too much power. And he dies a few months later in the dungeons of Falkland, with all of the power going to Albany. And this is my very favorite bit, okay? A few months after his death, an act of parliament, in order to clear a handful of important Scottish nobles from suspicion of David's murder, comes out and specifically states that David died, quote, by divine providence and not otherwise.
That's the divine right of kings thing. It pops up whenever it's convenient, isn't it?
I mean, it sure is convenient that he dies. He just goes into prison in his uncle's castle and then dies by divine providence and not otherwise. That's my favorite part of that.
Oh my god. Well, so dark tales indeed. I'm sure that his father must have been despairing of him, absolutely 100%. And his grandfather, poor Robert II, what he might have thought. But anyway, we would say he'd have rolled over in his grave if he'd known what was going on.
Well, he gets his in the end. Made me a little happy that he gets his. Sadly, because history is the way it is, we don't know what happened to his poor spurned lover, Elizabeth. But we will come back to her because she's, important in this story.
Yeah, I think.
Back to George, though. George goes over to the English and supposedly has a large part in engineering the strategy which led to the severe Scottish defeat at Homildon Hill. He then also stayed loyal to the English after the Percys defected and aided Henry IV to victory at Shrewsbury against Harry Hotspur Percy and Archibald IV Earl Douglas. So in his time in England, he manages to engineer 2 massive victories over Scottish forces.
Wow.
That very likely, or that possibly might not have happened without his help. Despite all this, George, of course, had lost all of his lands in Scotland. He'd not really received equivalent properties in England. So he seemed to always be poorly off. He was always asking the English crown for money. And eventually he returned to Scotland in 1409 and for some reason was given his earldom back. I mean, good for him. Though by that time, of course, its power had shrunk significantly because in the years that he was away, his nemesis, the Douglases, had taken lots of chunks off of it. George died sometime between 1416 and 1423, and he was buried in Dunbar Collegiate Church. After he died, his family fortunes never recovered. The earldom passed to his son, George, the 10th Earl, who was made Warden of the East March in 1424, but was replaced by William Douglas. So here's another Douglas coming for you, the 2nd Earl of Angus, in 1430. And in 1432, a dispute between George, the 10th Earl, and William, the Earl of Douglas, led George to be imprisoned and lose his title, ending the Dunbars period as Earls of Dunbar or March permanently. And eventually, George, the 10th Earl, also ended up seeking sanctuary in England.
Wow.
And all of this, their loss of fortunes, Hamilton Hill, possibly even Shrewsbury, because David, Duke of Rothesay, who would possibly have been David III, but, was imprisoned and died by divine providence.
Yes.
Jilted his daughter, Elizabeth. And yet we know nothing about Elizabeth. Apart from the fact that she was jilted, she disappears from history after she's jilted. But this incident changes the course of this branch of the Dunbars massively.
And thinking about all the work that had gone into maintaining that castle with all these, terrible situations, the sieges, all the things that they'd gone through, it's almost like it's just been squandered over very little. And poor jilted Lizzie, I wonder where she ended up. Bless her.
I don't know. I wonder where Bonnie Agnes ended up. John certainly wouldn't have been where he was without Bonnie Agnes.
No, he would not.
And we know very little about her after her interactions with David.
That's true. That's very true.
But the family would not have been nearly as important as they were if it weren't for her.
Yes, because very interestingly, I think it takes a wee bit extra digging to find out what the women that are in these families. Obviously you get a few names and dates, and very often you find, if you go back a few, maybe a couple of centuries on from this period, obviously this is the 14th century, if you go back to the 11th or 12th century, what you're finding is that there often isn't a female name unless her father is very, very important. Like, for example, say Walter III High Steward, his wife is known because she's Bettock de Angus, which she's related to a strong Northumbrian presence within that family. And they've been given names which are very, very Celtic there. I mean, even like some of the actual high stewards themselves, no one knows what their wives' names were, ? Like, there's one really important example was the Black Douglas. His wife was Joan ? When I was looking. The Black Douglas is one of the most famous men in Scottish history, and they didn't even know his wife's name. But they know his son's name because he had his dad's name. And you do wonder that they often just name the sons after their father so they'll be remembered. But who knows? We didn't have the same ability to record things as we've got today, so it's probably a little bit of that going on. There's also an extreme nepotism going on as well, if you ask me. But certainly you can imagine. I mean, I was in Dunbar back in 2019. I just decided to go. No, it was 2019. It must have been. I decided to go over to visit it because I've been very interested in the town, and actually discovered when I've been doing my own ancestry that I had my grandfather's name was Alexander Dunbar Sinclair, and his uncle's was also named that, and then his father. So we're going back to quite a long time, way back into the end of the 19th century. And my concern was that I couldn't understand why I was a Dunbar in the surname. What you do find is they often use like one of the maiden names as a surname for the boys, but there's no Dunbars there. So I was interested to find out. I think I'll just go there anyway as an excuse and go and visit it. And I really wanted to go and see the castle. And it was the most incredible place in terms of the ruins of the castle. If you certainly get a chance to go to Dunbar, have a look. because the castle is just this great big massive curtain wall. That's all that's left of it, and really basically it's just like a almost like a there's terns and all different seabirds nesting in it, and it's an awful racket. You can just hear them all screeching, and they also swooped on me because I was too nosy. I was going a bit close. I probably shouldn't have, and they were swooping, but you could see exactly what I was thinking. I bet there's been a sea gate there. I just thought it in my mind, and sure enough, we found that out in our research. So it's lovely to find answers to some of the things you've thought of, but it's been there since basically right back to the times of the same as Dundonald Castle. I mean, Dun is obviously the Gaelic name for Hellfort. So we know there's been a Hellfort there at some point way back in probably the Iron Age. And seemingly that was actually on where the high street is now, not where the castle is, interestingly, because Hellforts weren't necessarily built right at the sea, because they were mainly made of wood. They wouldn't have the same protection that stone would have had. There's connections as well. If we were I quite like to discuss things that go as far back as Duncan the First and Macbeth, right? Obviously another dark and grisly story, of which there are quite a lot of truths. And I've actually been looking into that because I'm going to be writing a blog post about it, because I found there was actually connections between the real story of Macbeth and his cousin Duncan I, and that was that connects into Dundonald Castle. So that's always quite interesting to find out. But there's also connections to Dunbar Castle as well, because basically it was found to be that Dunbar Castle was built by Malcolm III, and his name was Malcolm Cownmore, which means, in translate from Gaelic, is Cown is the Gaelic word for head, and More is the word for big. So let's imagine this guy who was called Malcolm the third, big head, basically. So let's imagine what he might have looked like. But that's easier for me than it is going down on the list of Patrick's. Actually, I can cope with that better.
I think it's easier. It's easier when we have Earl Patrick and Sir Patrick, not Earl. It's easier for me to remember it that way.
I know. I think they must have been doing that then as well. He was basically he actually invited this guy called Errol Goss Patrick. So sorry to bring Patrick's back in immediately after we said that. Errol Goss Patrick of Northumbria. He was probably his cousin, we think, around about the year 1072. And Malcolm needed to fill a power vacuum in his southeastern flank. So he invited Goss Patrick to come up from Northumbria, and he granted them the lands around Dunbar, and which he formed, great extensive swathes of land. Obviously, Dunbar was just part of it, right up to East Lothian and parts of Berwickshire, which then we call the Merseys again. And Goss Patrick founded the family of the Dunbar family. So taking us to the story of the Agneses, and it became the House of Dunbar, and its heads becoming the Earls of Dunbar later on. And the Scottish borders were basically their jurisdiction, and that was their job, was to patrol those borders to make sure they were safe. And I presume that most of them did that job well, which is why George was given that task. And as far as I'm aware, he did an amazing job. He managed to protect it for 20 years. But it sits on the point of land, the castle, right? And it's open, right? Sea views that you can see, as I said earlier, straight across to Edinburgh and Fife in a clear day. And it'd be such a favoured position in terms of defensive structure. But basically, it's a really interesting place to visit. And also, if you're moving away slightly from the history of the castle, there's a place called the John Muir Trust, which is based there. And it was a man who was born in Dunbar in 1838, and it was his birthplace museum house is there. So you can actually go into the house. Now, I think it's actually the next door neighbour's house they've got, because the one he actually had, they couldn't get. I think I might be wrong, right? But you're supposed to just imagine.
They did their best.
They did their very best, and it's amazing to go in, and it's got beautiful displays. And his whole ethos was about valuing nature and conservation. So, as I say, he was born in 1838, and eventually his family moved over to America, and he became part of he became the father of the national park. So for the Americans, he's a very important person, and he was inspired by the wonderful country and coastal scenery around Dunbar from his childhood. Another Ayrshire connection with him is that he was a great lover of Robert Burns's work. So he apparently took his poems and books with him everywhere he wandered around the prairies and various places he went to in the Americas at that time. And he was especially interested in the wars of independence, because he knew all about the stuff that had gone on. So it's a shame we couldn't have had him on here tonight live, isn't it?
I would imagine, being from Dunbar, you must have been interested in history, especially in sort of late 18th, early 19th century is when people really start becoming interested in the history of their own country in Britain. And so I think, of course, in Dunbar, it's such a crucial location for the Wars of Independence. I mean, the Battle of Dunbar is really the first battle in the Wars of Independence between England and Scotland. Is, you know, there's raiding that happens before then, but that's the first time that they clash. And it's such a key site that's traded back and forth between the English and the Scottish throughout the Wars of Independence. I can't imagine not catching that fever living there.
Yes, and apparently he particularly because Robert Burns obviously wrote quite a lot of his work about Robert the Bruce and William Wallace and various characters around the First War of Independence. And I think he would have got the fever from that. And I do believe he also took those ideas of Robert Burns over to America when he was staying there. But he was noted for being a very ecological thinker, a political spokesman, and a bit of a religious prophet whose writings have become massively important to those who this day are really interested in environmental consciousness. And I would absolutely advise anyone to go along to see the museum. It's got some lovely inspiring ideas, and also you can go along and do part of what they call the John Muir Way, and you can visit the John Muir National Park, which is all nearby. And the John Muir Way actually takes you along the coast, and you can see Bass Rock, which is the most incredible piece of great big rock that sticks out of the sea. And what I noticed when I was there was that in certain lights, it could look white, it could look lilac, or it could look really dark, like really super sort of storm grey. And the sea would come in really quickly. It's an enormous beach.
Isn't that Bass Rock? Isn't that the bit you can see from Tintagel as well?
Yes, yeah, it's very near Tintagel. It's just basically just along the coast.
Oh, there's another place you go to Dunbar. You can hop to Tintagel.
And except that when I went, it was a thunderstorm, and I thought, no, I'll just go home and come back another day. I said, bother going to Tintagel.
Oh my God, Gwen, when COVID is over, please take me on a day trip.
Oh, we could do that.
That's when Neil and I go over there, we do Tintagel, Durlton, and Hales is another one that's like right near it. And it's a free one because there's not too much left, but it is gorgeous. So we leave like early in the morning because it's quite a hike. And then we do all three of them in the day. So it's worth going over there.
Have you been to Rosslyn yet? See, that's Sinclair territory. I should take you. And the castle there is absolutely amazing. Rosslyn, maybe we could do that because it's kind of like en route. It's not that far. I think it's one of the coolest places in Scotland at the moment because I haven't really explored it very much. I would like people to go to see Dunbar Castle. For all it's just a ruin, I would love to see. I think people would love to see what it was like, especially that sea gate. That saved their bacon with all the sieges.
The remains of it remind me of Berwick Castle, which is another one that is
amazing.
There's not much left, but it is so amazing and impactful to go visit. And just to think of the importance of what used to be there, and you know how strategic it was, and how much back and forth, and I mean, I hate to say how bloody it was, but really, I mean, there's so much significance to that place that you almost can't soak it in when you're there. And I don't think they do it justice at all. I mean, there's almost no like signs or anything that tell you what anything is in Berwick. It's really sad.
It is really sad. But well, basically, Dunbar Castle itself, as I said, I think people should try and go and see it. It's just down by the harbour, and it's such a lovely old historic town. It's nothing, it's not a place you wouldn't want to go for a day out, because you can walk down the high street, and there's that really lovely kind of wee art gallery and museum that's in, I think it must have been the old toll booth, and then there's lovely little cafes and bars and lovely little craft shops as well. And I just think it's really sweet. But you can cut down through some various different streets. And as you cut down one street, you pass this one, which is called the Black Agnes Restaurant, right? Above the door, there's a swinging, one of those swinging kind of signs, which is a beautiful picture of the castle. It's like a lovely kind of gold and, a really well made sign. But I think that's part of the Castle Hotel. So it's on Castle Street. So when you see things like Castle Street, you're on the way to the castle at that point. So you're walking about, you don't get lost. But it's supposed to be really good. It's a popular place to drink Bellhaven beer, because Bellhaven Brewery was the wee place where I was staying, was just nearby there. It's amazing. And you walk down and there's a wee lifeboat station as well, which apparently was like the second that was ever there's ever been. You can see, when you go there, you can see why they need a lifeboat station there. Absolutely wild. The sea is really, really high, and you can just imagine it crashing in over the rocks, because that's basically straight out onto the North Sea. So it's pretty wild in the winter. But the Dunbar Castle, I mean, the archaeological evidence has quite a lot of interest in it. It was apparently burnt down by Kenneth MacAlpine. He was the king of the Picts and Scots around 858. It seems as if this was done as an attempt to restore the land to Scotland for the Kingdom of Northumbria. So there we go, there's that theme again. So in 1073, it appears to have belonged to the Earls of March, or the Borderlands, and the medieval occupation of the site associated with Dunbar has the foundations for a curtain wall, which you can see when you go there. And they were excavated, and it was associated cobbled surface, which is really fascinating to see. It's a totally different style of castle than we see in Dundonald, which is really thick grey stone. This has got like completely a different way. I suspect they've even used the mortar differently if you have a closer look at it. There was a panel bearing the arms of George the 10th Earl of Dunbar above the door, right? And it was positioned above a large doorway until about October 1869. And apparently, there was a great big storm and it blew it away, and they never saw it again. So that was there, and that was a shame, because we'd have loved to see that, Blythe, wouldn't we?
That panel disappeared by divine providence and no other.
It went down the same road as the jilted Lizzie. Jilted Lizzie didn't. But the importance of the castle is very obvious. Right beside the sea, it covers a really large part of the whole coastal. It's like the coast is really rugged. It's not a smooth path, and it basically wove round the coast. And perhaps if we maybe move on then to talk about what Black Agnes was up to.
I think this podcast, we're coming to an end here, and I know we've talked a lot about the men, haven't we? But yes. I think the point is, we're talking about the men because we know more about the men, but what we're trying to put across is that this is a story about how much the women impacted the story of the Dunbars in the 14th century. And that story certainly isn't complete without Black Agnes.
It certainly is not. I mean, she was quite a character. And also, I think by her very behaviour tells you that women weren't as expected to be only sitting around doing embroidery and playing the harp and singing and all sorts of things like that. Women had to be trained, especially the noble women, in this very difficult period in the history, where the Battle of Dunbar was one of the starts of that was in 1296, was it? 96, yes. It was the start of the First War of Independence, which we do know kind of came to something of a halt. We can't say it ever ended, around about the time just before Bruce died, but then it all kicked off again. It never really ended. So they were in the midst of this for their entire lives. They never really had a period in their lives where this wasn't going on. So these women were really ready to fight, and they were probably trained, and they were also very clever. They were quite savvy. So basically, the story of Agnes's siege was the 13th of January 1338, when her husband Patrick, the 8th Earl, was away. Now the English came along and they laid siege to Dunbar Castle, where Lady Dunbar, who was also known as Black Agnes, was in residence with her servants and a few guards. However, she was determined not to surrender the fortress, even though the English were vastly superior in numbers, reckoning roughly about 20,000 men. That was one story that I heard. I can't actually imagine it would be that many, but this is
all chronicle accounts, isn't it? So yeah. It's so difficult to trust the numbers, but it's nice to imagine 20,000 men camped outside Dunbar Castle.
And she was only in there with a few of her guards and some servants, and that was all. So apparently she said, "O Scotland's king, I hoard my house, I pay him meat and fee, and I will give my good old house, while my house will keep me." Apparently she said that. And then the castle was under her command, and she basically decided she wasn't going to give in. So the Earl of Salisbury, the English commander, opened siege by hurling huge rocks at the walls of the castle using a great catapult. Between these attacks, and in clear view of the English, Agnes sent her maids dressed in their Sunday finest onto the ramparts to dust and clean the marks of the shots that had come through the walls with dainty white handkerchiefs. In other words, we didn't cause us any trouble here. So Salisbury was forced to roll out his secret weapon, which was a huge battering ram or sow with a wooden roof to protect the men underneath. Agnes was ready for this. Of course she was, wasn't she? Of course she was, Blythe. She signalled for boulders to be thrown down on the ramparts, and she crushed the roof of this sow battering ram to bits. So this happened, as we said, in January. So it started early in the year of 1338, and they were still outside when spring came along. The siege continued. The last of the castle's winter supplies nearly exhausted, Salisbury finally sensed an end and possible victory. Its help for the defenders finally came from the sea when Alexander Ramsay of Dalhousie arrived with men and supplies in 2 boats. So they came in through the sea gate via a half-submerged concealed doorway. It's said that the following morning, Agnes sent a freshly baked loaf and some fine wine to the English commanders and had the gift's arrival proclaimed loudly. In desperation, Salisbury was absolutely raging, and he sent for Agnes's brother, the Earl of Murray. Murray had previously been captured and was a prisoner of the English. He was brought to within sight of the castle and forced by Salisbury to call to Agnes to surrender the castle or he would be killed. So basically he's been taken as a hostage. Agnes simply pointed out that should her brother be killed, who had no children, then she would inherit the title and become the next Earl of Murray. So
please do.
Go on, punk, make my day. That's what she said, right? And Salisbury quickly recognised the flaw in his argument and let the Earl live. Finally, on the 10th of June, so we're talking 5-6 months, Salisbury realised that he would never get the better of Agnes, or nor would he get the better of the castle. I think it's got a lot to be said about the defences of this castle. As the mighty conquerors marched away, the men made up a song. She makes a stir in tower and trench, that brawling boisterous Scottish wench. Came I early, came I late, I found Agnes at the gate. And just to conclude, Walter Scott mentioned her in his writings, and he said, from the record of Scottish heroes, none can presume to erase her. So basically, in Walter Scott's opinion, there was no more hero in the whole of history of Scotland than Agnes.
Apart from James V. House Stewart.
Oh, yes, sorry, yes. But I suspect that Walter Scott didn't know anything about him.
Exactly.
Walter Scott was only interested in people on the East Coast because that's where he came from. Folk for the West Coast. And we all know this, Blythe, don't we? The West is best.
Yes. Right, guys, watch the space. James V. House Stewart. Right. Before we wrap up, I'd like to stick just one more honorable mention out there. Marjorie Comyn. She is the wife of Earl Patrick's father, right? So the 7th Earl Patrick. Sorry, this is another Earl Patrick we haven't even spoken about. But this particular, the 7th Earl of March or Dunbar, was the Earl when the Wars of Independence began. And he apparently sided with Edward I. But somehow, some way, he sided with Edward I, but Dunbar Castle ended up being handed to his wife, Marjorie Comyn, who held it against the English at the Battle of Dunbar. And of course, she ended up losing it, but I think that still deserves honorable mention, don't you?
I do indeed. Wow, yeah, definitely. She did an amazing job as well. So it seems that castle has a history of women going there and it being besieged and then them holding the fort, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, she doesn't have quite the heroic tale that Black Agnes has, but I think she deserves to be on the list.
Well, if Walter Scott knew about her as well, he might have added her to the list. I don't think we should worry too much about that, though.
Unfortunately, the Battle of Dunbar in 1296 was a horrible loss for the Scots, and
it's hideous.
The English end up getting the castle, but I think that's not really her fault, is it? That's more John Comyn's fault. Yes. Marjorie, I wonder if you think that's her brother?
I think I was imagining that he was the Red Comyn, because that's what he's mentioned as. See, this is the thing. What they do is they call people by the colour of the colour of their hair. Black Agnes, Red Comyn. Basically, the boys are called Arbuia, which is Gaelic for yellow, because they were yellow-haired people. So people were named by what they looked like. So yeah,
I like that. You just call me Blue Blythe from now on.
Blue Blythe. Oh yeah. Okay, let's go Gorham. It's blue, isn't it? Yeah. So Blythe Gorham. That sounds a bit, it doesn't sound good, does it?
It doesn't sound very nice, no.
Bluish yellow, it sounds lovely. But basically, Marjorie Cummin was very supportive of John Balloyle. That was her thing. She was like supporting him secretly, maybe. And apparently at the time of the battle, John the King, that's King John Balloyle, was actually only camped at Haddington, so he wasn't too far away, and she got word to come and send help. But unfortunately, but actually at that battle, the Red Cummin, he actually was taken prisoner. So that was a terrible loss for Scotland at the start of the Wars of Independence.
Right. I think that brings us to the end. As we always do, let's ask, why is this important to us? Not Scotland and not us personally, but us at Dundonald Castle. I think I can say it's pretty important to us because, as we've said, the Dunbars are pretty heavily involved with both Robert II and Robert III, as we've kind of highlighted throughout this episode. And of course, Robert II's the guy that builds our castle, and he spends some time at Dundonald Castle, and then his son Robert III spends a significant amount of time at Dundonald Castle. So the fact that they're both so heavily linked in his court are important. The other thing that I find it's kind of an interesting link between them is that Dunbar Castle was slighted in the Wars of Independence to keep it from being useful to the English. That happened around 1314, so it's a decent period of time after it happened at Dundonald, but that's another link because that happened to Alexander's castle at Dundonald. So I think that's just another way that this topic can link back to us. What about you, Gwen?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely 100% agree. It feels to me, if you have a look at that, the family, the lineage chart that I've made up today after you've listened to the podcast, you'll see that I've put in purple everybody who's connected to Dundonald Castle. And it kind of steals the show a little bit because of the Stuarts connection there, and the fact that, as I said earlier, both sides of the family, everything traces back to them. So they feel like they're not quite the Adam and Eve of Scotland, Walter and Bethog, but they kind of are actually if you look at the lineage. And I feel as if that a lot of it happened in the East Coast, but the people who are involved in it were from this neck of the woods, they're from Ayrshire, they were from Renfrewshire, they were from the Isle of Bute. There's a lot of people connected up to what was going on over this side of the country. But I suspect that this was almost the escape zone. If you think about everything that was happening in the borders between England and Scotland at the Mersheys at the time, coming over here would be a bit of an escape, and there would have been less chance of being under attack. I think there was battles happening here, but it wasn't as furious and it wasn't as often. And so maybe they came over here, it was like, coming over here to about hunting and fishing and relaxing and that kind of thing, until it really kicked off for good, and then that completely changed. But the early days, I think,
we're the leisure coast.
Yes, absolutely. So you can imagine them coming and having feasts, and Dundonald Castle was certainly built for feasts. So later on, so
hunting and feasting,
yes, and lots of music and singing, and James would have been there enjoying himself too.
Well, I think poor James just had a hill. James had an empty hill. He gets the short end of the stick.
Oh,
that's why I find him so interesting. James inherited a giant castle and tears it down, or it's torn down for him. Question mark. Watch this space.
Yes. Yeah, I think that'll have to be the next one. The next exciting episode of Tales from the Castle will be James the Fifth High Steward of Scotland, circa 1243 to 1309. So we're going a wee bit further back in history for this one.
Love me some James the Fifth High Steward. That's us then today. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying tuned through another episode of Tales from the Castle. And as always, thank you so much, Gwen, for sitting with me through another episode.
Oh, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been fantastic. Subjects I like to talk about.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to email me, Blythe, at education@dundonaldcastle.org.uk. And otherwise, please just stay tuned for our next episode, and we will be back soon. Bye!
Bye!
The Tales from the Castle podcast is recorded with and on behalf of the Friends of Dundonald Castle. However, all thoughts and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own. Our theme song comes from Blacksmith, composed by Alexander Nakarada, and can be accessed in full online on serpentsoundstudios.com. The Friends of Dundonald Castle are a registered charity, SCIO number SC031541. If you are interested in learning more about Dundonald Castle or supporting our charity, please see our website, dundonaldcastle.org.uk, or follow us on social media. We can be found on Facebook at Dundonald Castle and Visitor Centre, on Instagram at Dundonald_Castle, on Twitter at Dundonald Castle, or on our YouTube channel, Dundonald Castle Education. Thank you so much.